Otherwise, please take a seat. We're going to get started with the next panel. I know. We think it's a great sign that you're speaking, but now we must start the panel. All right. So our next panel is going to be on local ownership and governance and technologies that enable this. So I'm going to kick it over to the panel real quick. Just introduce us, tell us what you're building in the space, and we'll start with you, Ethan.
All right. So I'm Ethan. Hey, listen up.
That's what it takes.
Someone's got to do it. So I'm Ethan. I'm very good at shutting people up. I co-founded Cosmos some 7 years ago or so. So I've been building in the crypto space for a long time. Cosmos is based on a set of values rooted in sovereignty and interoperability. We believe that communities all over the world should be able to be sovereign over their own infrastructure and applications, but that sovereignty shouldn't come at the expense of interoperability. And so we built technology that follows from those principles that allow anyone really to build their own, what we call community computer, which is our preferred term for blockchains. These days, we're working on trying to bring real-world solutions to help small businesses with cash flow problems, which very quickly turn into solvency problems, and trying to address the sort of liquidity challenges that they face using what we call collaborative finance, which is our response to decentralized finance, which we think is largely incomplete, but we'll get into that.
Lindsay.
Great. Good morning or afternoon, I guess, everyone. My name is Lindsay Moore. I am CEO of Develop Metrics. We are an AI company that builds large language models, mostly for the social sector, for U.S. government, helping better allocate aid money and social spending. And then we also are now building some models to help improve localization and decision-making of those receiving or those who are living in countries that are receiving foreign assistance, actually having a decision in whether that money is being allocated.
Jeff.
All right, I'm Jeff Mendelson. I love the range of activities here represented on stage. So I work in communities of color across the country, mostly Black communities and urban environments, to help build wealth and well-being through local ownership of real estate. And we focus on large mixed-use real estate projects because we think they're upstream of so many issues that communities are facing, and they can be catalytic to build wealth and well-being. And real estate's been a key driver of displacement and exclusion and extraction in these communities for generations. And so the model is a platform with a national nonprofit that supports local leaders to step into that leadership role in these large projects. And then we align incentives between the investors and community members over a process of years where they make the projects valuable by activating them and then have the opportunity to buy in, and the initial investors go out at a non-extractive rate. And you end up with a community with more agency and more wealth and more ownership.
Awesome. And then lastly, but not least, Sean, who's calling in from, I believe, South Africa. Thanks for joining us, Sean.
I think Singapore is like 2:30 a.m. But good to see friends across the world and to feel actually very closely connected to everyone. And I think it's kind of a testament to how the gap between global markets and global economy kind of connects into a very local level. And so what I've been doing over the last 10 years is building out a digital infrastructure for the impact economy. So enabling people around the world to coordinate, finance, and verify impacts using verified data and bringing in AI capabilities as well into that. And it's built on me, so that's what I mean at Cosmos SDK. So we're grateful to Ethan for funding that. And really some really relevant work which I'd like to talk about as part of the panel discussion and really enabling a flipping of the economic model in countries like Tanzania.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for staying up till 2:30 a.m. for us. It was I hope it was due to jet lag and not just us. Great. So we're going to talk a lot about local ownership today, but first I want to set a little bit of the context, like why does this matter now at this point, right? We're kind of I don't know how long this is going to last. But we keep hearing like, oh, we're at the tail end of neoliberalism or capitalism, whatever you want to call it. There's been a large collectivizing movement around global capital, globalization, absentee owners in one place and another, what have you. And we're here all to talk about local ownership, local decision making, all that kind of stuff. So the first thing I'd like to throw out to you all is, why local ownership? What's different around for local ownership versus, I guess you could maybe call it what's now become like the traditional ownership model, right? Ethan, maybe we'll start with you.
What's different with local ownership?
Why that?
Why does this matter? Everyone here knows.
Do they know?
Preaching to the choir. Have something more interesting.
Hey, you're allowed to riff on the question. Make it more interesting, my friend.
All right, fair enough. I guess the way I think about it, I studied biophysics. My background is trying to understand what makes systems sustainable and how emergent systems emerge in this universe, and in a universe where the second law of thermodynamics says everything's running down. So how do these systems run up? And the understanding I developed is that sustainable systems are ones that effectively represent their environment. They're able to model internally in their structure the energy signals, the driving signals that keep them alive, that allow them to respond and store up energy and so on. And the way our society is structured today does a really bad job, I think, of modeling its boundaries, of modeling its environment. So there's so much abstraction going on. Everything is reduced in dimensionality to a single number or single kind of ownership structure. And that destroys a lot of information that makes us fundamentally fragile. And I see local ownership as a way of sort of correcting that, better representing the actual world, the sort of social and ecological foundations that drive these systems out of equilibrium. And that's necessary in order to achieve some form of sustainability. So it's a very abstract answer, but that's how I think about things.
No, I think it makes sense. And then Lindsay, you're working in development finance, aid, and what have you. What have you seen over the span of your career, right, where you have philanthropy kind of on the other side of the world, but eventually they have their own outcomes and objectives that they want? And what is the possibility? Why should we be thinking about local stewardship or decision making with respect to that space?
Yeah, and I thought your question was a very good one, Josh, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if you just maybe read the World Bank report, although the World Bank just said 60% of the reports are never even downloaded, so you probably didn't. But if you did read the latest one, they said the SDGs are not going to be achieved, and it's not for lack of money. It's actually, they're saying lack of efficient use of that money. And so that's a lot of what we do at Develop Metrics, is using large language models to mine all the information and provide the answers. And we thought that would be enough naively. But then you really see, okay, it's not just about having the right information, it's who has that information and who is using that information to drive decision making. And the US government spends $41 billion a year giving money to developing countries to improve health outcomes, climate change, education, and the majority of that money is actually being wasted. And I believe a reason for that is because only 6% of that money is actually going to local organizations to solve the problems in their own countries. The majority of that money is going to US firms to actually implement these projects in these countries with the knowledge, with the answers. And so if you actually get more of the money in the hands of those who are being affected by these projects, then the outcomes would be incredibly greater.
Jeff, what do you think?
So I'll attempt to transcend and include. Everybody knows the answer, and it's a really good question at the same time.
Crypto versus AI.
So, ownership and governance are the twin ghosts in the machine, and everybody in the room knows this. And especially Black Americans have faced a lot of structural inequities, making it very hard to own. And a lot of the efforts in the communities are very Band-Aid. And not to knock them, but dealing with symptoms, not upstream problems, which is this opportunity to own. And so our model, we actually focus on large mixed-use projects and a broad-based ownership structure where through a direct public offering, anybody in the community can buy in with as little as $100. So it's a broad-based agency building and ownership building initiative trying to reverse, again, generations of trends of limiting agency, limiting ownership, and ultimately limiting quality of life and well-being.
Now, Sean, we turn to you. You've had also kind of a long background in aid. I'd love to hear what do you think the promise is of including, local governance, local actors in the disbursement of aid, and take it wherever you like. I know you're working on a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so development is a local process, and what we find in the current system is that people who are supposed to be part of the development process are often aliens in this huge social inequities, mainly because rights are generally transferred or enacted to economic means, and so when people don't have the rights to transact, or the capabilities to transact in local economies, and also don't have rights of the means of production, then we get the sort of ongoing exploitation. There's a really interesting opportunity now with the new economy that is emerging around climate finance. And if we really think about the model of climate finance, is the producers of climate impacts or reducing mitigating the impacts of climate, who really are the source of the change that needs to happen. And so, as an example, in Zambia, we are working with fuel switching to clean cooking from traditional charcoal cooking. And it's really the households who are making that change. They're changing their behaviors, they're changing their purchasing patterns. They are investing in the new clean energy prices. And so, why should we perpetuate a system where the carbon credits, for instance, that get generated from this really get to benefit the financiers and the project developers? And so, using the technologies that have these capabilities to transfer rights of ownership and rights of creating beneficiation out of these technologies, we now have footstove owners, customers of the service providers who are creating their own carbon credits and directly benefiting from that. And they can use the carbon credit as a currency. So you have the first transaction where the customers are able to purchase the next batch of their renewable biomass pellets that fuels the stoves, and they can actually buy that with carbon credits. And they're in control of the payments for the cooking device. And so it's really sort of flipping the whole model in terms of who owns the means of production, who benefits from it, and who has the power to then negotiate what services and economic actions are going to take.
That's a great example of flipping that on its head. That makes a ton of sense. I want to cede the next question to Jeff, because Jeff, you're sitting next to a handful of technologists here who are kind of ostensibly building tech for local ownership and governance, what have you. And you're close to these problems in real life. A lot of them are as well, but you ostensibly, that's your only business, right? So I'd love to hear a bit from you. Maybe you can tell us, what is a problem that would benefit from technologies targeting local ownership, right? What is that problem space?
All right, it's kind of a layup, but it's good. So I'll just start with two anecdotes. So we launched in Kansas City, and we're partnering with Asia Morris and Maisha Wright, who are two amazing Black women entrepreneurs that live on the east side of Kansas City, which is a very segregated city down Troost Avenue, which was chosen as the dividing line between the redlining dividing line, where they segregated the town. It's a longer story. And one neighborhood has a strong neighborhood association, well-run, and the other one doesn't. And I'm a voice for my partners. This is not my opinion. It's their local leadership and their opinions. And so what's interesting today, there's a lot of conversation around governance, and there's sort of the rosy glasses, we're going to be super distributed, and then there's this sort of how do you get there? And one thing we do is we try to be very collaborative and not reinvent things. So there's a group called the Movement Strategy Center out of the Bay Area that put a multi-year project called Facilitating Power, and it's a sort of evolution from engagement to ownership. And we use their high-level model. It goes from 0, 1, and 2, which are not good, to 3, 4, and 5, which is voice, power, and ownership. And so using that framework with the local partners with their leadership, we are engaging the community on a journey to voice, power, and ownership. Where tech comes in is our mission is to, again, have a broad-based agency, broad-based ownership structure. So we need to be able to have a tech platform that has very low cost of transaction. If somebody's going to invest $100, transaction costs could easily exceed that in a old school system. We need a system that can do know your customer on, being a local resident. Are they a business owner, or how are they engaged in the property? We need a tech platform that will help us with a secondary market function. So when the community member wants to take their money out and send their college to school, there's an easy way to do that. And our job, frankly, as a partner to the tech solution, is to do a really good job on the actual use of the tech. So and we don't have to choose our tech platform for another 3 years or so, because the local ownership kicks in over a period of time. So we're excited about that. Our job is to have a really well-designed use case where we already have a good nuanced understanding of governance challenges and opportunities, and so that the tech platform can step into a really well-designed use case so we actually deliver on our purpose.
So Ethan, I kind of want to hit you with this one, because one of the reasons why I like you and why I wanted you on this is because you spent quite a bit of time, getting into the weeds of criticizing, crypto, Web3, whatever you want to call it, just not really addressing real world use cases, right? So you heard a number of things here, which I'm sure you haven't heard for the first time, right? What are the real opportunities, maybe not necessarily for Ko-Fi, but just maybe within Cosmos or within the wider blockchain space, where you're like, this is a connection we need to make to things like this, right, that you've seen?
I hope next I can hear the reasons you don't like me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the blockchain space for like 10 years now. I'm a bit jaded with how useless the technology is in so many applications. It's a little bit frustrating. I think there is, there's something fundamental about a sort of, cryptography guaranteeing a kind of international human right to privacy, and cryptocurrencies as guaranteeing a sort of fundamental human right to transact. Of course, there's two sides to that. What we're looking at now is, I felt for a long time that money is the killer app, but I wasn't really sure what that meant exactly. And so I've sort of been diving in to try to understand what money is and what it means and where it comes from and why, and what it might actually mean to like responsibly, intervene in the banking system and stuff like that. And I think that's where there is some real application for this. And, we can get into the Ko-Fi stuff maybe a little later. But, what I've seen time and time again is that so many of the problems aren't technical problems. They're like social political problems. They're, cultural problems. And just coming up with a technical solution, isn't really going to help, right? And like you just said, you've got a few years even before you need the technology. But you also mentioned transaction costs, right? Well, why are the transaction costs so high? Is that a technology problem, or is it, does it come from the structure of the institutions, the laws? Maybe technology can start to help that, but there's often a flip side to bringing those costs down as well that we don't think about.
Yeah, and in those communities that Jeff, you're working in, there's like a generational lack of access to capital in a lot of ways. It causes all kinds of liquidity crunches, right? Like both in the technical macro way and even just in the day-to-day. So then, Lindsay, given your long career in, DeFi and not that DeFi, development finance, not DeFi, got to get it right for this audience. And, working with USAID in your past life, you've been to places where essentially, like, we're not talking about, I live in, East Oakland, I don't have access to capital. I live in a place where I can't have access to $1 or a bank account, right? So like, maybe you can tell us a little about, you're working on developed metrics and really trying to optimize development finance, but, getting into the real meat of that problem, kind of the way that Jeff said, I'd love to hear kind of what you noticed and why you decided to build for that use case.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, like I said, I think a lot of the issues come from a lack of, too much evidence out there, which isn't able to be optimally used, actually. And now that we have large language models, we're able to synthesize an incredible amount of information and make informed decisions. And I thought, that we could stop there, but now I'm realizing the local voice has to be much larger represented in who's making those decisions. But the problem why it's not is because all this money is coming from the U.S. government, which is governed by actually the military. The first way the US government actually spent money abroad was in military endeavors. And the whole aid industry is based off of something called the FAR, which is how governs the rules of how US money can be given abroad. And so obviously there's not a lot of room there to support local organizations. If you're thinking of it coming from the military, it doesn't have that inclusive voice. And so in a lot of development projects, you see that military aspect, even with people trying to, with the best intentions, help, give money to solve local problems. You can't based on the structure. But we're lucky enough to find a gap in the federal regulation that actually enables or local organizations to partner with U.S. companies and be brought into the rules of the game, and actually not have to go through the incredible vetting process that you usually have to go to deal with government money. And so what we're doing is creating a tokenized system which kind of incentivizes the normal government partners. They're called the Beltway Bandits in DC, the same huge corporations that partner again and again with USAID to do these projects. How do you incentivize them to bring in local organizations to actually do the work through a tokenized system?
So that's amazing, because that just backs it. I really want to learn more about this, and this gets right into the next topic, because really rights and governance with respect to these systems, right? We're talking about people who don't have them or have have a lack of them, and don't even have the ability to really begin to build that. So some of the stuff that Sean was talking about as well with respect to kind of flipping that dynamic. I wanted to open this question up to the panel next and say, we touched on how a lot of this is a social political problem, but what is what's got you excited, at least in 2023, about how tech could really redefine some of the ability for people to participate in rights and governance in these systems? Any of you can start. Sean, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally the technology enables the execution of rights. So in a way that when we disintermediate some of the kind of features of the system that we've seen before. And so bringing these technologies together, whether it's a digital technology together with like a physical technology like a bookstore or a water pump, and bringing this into a system that is able to then generate participation mechanisms. So I'm just to make it really, really nuts and bolts. When a bookstore gets delivered into a household, they now have a digital carbon credit producing machine, and if they have the rights to that, they now get access to digital finance without needing to go buy a fiat contract, which doesn't exist. And so I think this is a gateway to what has been built over the last years with this DeFi innovations, whether it's current insurance or microfinance or all these hundreds of great ideas and automations and tools, and now we can actually create access to them. Now, that is not us when we want to say you now have the right to use digital finance, is providing the capability with the right to the means of production that generates the value. So I think sort of bringing the systems perspective and being innovative in how we see these different technologies and capabilities connecting in order to free up people's rights. That's a kind of modern version of I'm giving someone a shovel, we can dig for gold,
Right.
take the gold and get some benefit out of it.
Got it. And I think that actually so you set the stage pretty well now by talking about the various problems of the existing systems, some of the solutions y'all are working on, and really looking at it from the voice perspective in some ways, and how that's now leading to the access to liquidity. So now that's kind of where I want to focus next. And Ethan, maybe you can kick us off here, right? So you mentioned, you made kind of like a tantalizing aside to collaborative finance, right? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what does that mean, right? Because we've talked about development finance, we've talked about kickstarting the system, we've talked about how folks don't have access to finance, but what could we do to make finance more collaborative? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we've been trying to come at the problem of, let's say, monetary economics from first principles, and the crux of money is that, at least the way I understand it now, is that money is for payments. A lot of crypto people think money is about storing value and hedging inflation and evading the government and all this kind of stuff. I think that maybe comes later. But fundamentally, money is for payments, which means it's for denominating debt and discharging debt. And in the design of our payment systems, no one is really thinking about, well, how do we make sure we can actually discharge all the debt that is denominated, right? So you can create as much debt as you want, but how do you know that you're going to be able to pay it all off? And in some sense, it seems like the financial system is predicated on the idea that all the debt will not ever be able to be paid off, and that's part of how people are kept kind of in an oppressed state, and the sort of there's this debt oppression, let's say, right? And so we're looking at a design of the payment system that starts from that fundamental question of how can you build a system that reduces the most debt with the least amount of money, and that question sort of spawns this idea of what we call collaborative finance. And essentially, the notion is that, well, there's a lot of activity in the economy. There's a structure to that activity. It's not random. Debts are not just like randomly created. They're created when people buy and sell things, and there's structure in that. There's a graph structure in that, and you can take advantage of the graph structure. So what I mean by that is that if I owe Jahed and you owe Jeff, and Jeff owes Lindsay and Lindsay owes me, there's a closed loop there, right? And you might not normally be aware of that loop because you're usually only looking at as a sort of selfish, rational agent. You can only see your bilateral relations. But when you can start to take more of a network view, then you can access the liquidity that's hidden in the graph itself, right? And so when you have that closed loop, you can actually clear all those debts, or at least the smallest amount, without using any money at all, right? And so suddenly you're taking a step towards answering that question of how do you reduce more debt with less money? And you can take that further by reducing debt that's in chains, so it doesn't just have to be in loops, by allowing currency diversity, people's willingness to use different currencies to again improve liquidity in the graph, even if your direct counterparty doesn't want to use the same currency as you. So if I owe Jahed and Jahed owes Jeff, and I want to use Bitcoin, and you don't want to use Bitcoin, but Jeff does, normally we kind of can't do anything about that. But by, again, seeing the network structure of the graph, you can, right? So exposing that network allows you to actually access a lot of liquidity that's hidden in the network that the banks don't want you to find, because the banks make their profits off of you being in a gridlock situation, saying, well, I need to take out a loan from the bank to make this payment. And so there's a lot of hidden liquidity in the network that you can start to take advantage of. And so it's the pooling of debts in a common area, and you can even do this in a privacy preserving way. And this is where the blockchain technology actually unlocks this potential kind of uniquely, that gives rise to this notion of collaborative finance. So it's collaborating to reduce debt with less money.
And so that's why I'm also glad that you're sitting next to Lindsay, because I would love to hear a little bit of perspective from yourself on how this type of tool that can increase liquidity injection and payment networks in local economies, maybe developing ones, what do you actually see as their potential impact on local economies? You've seen this stuff up close. You've seen really debt-laden situations as well. What are the possibilities there? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the possibilities are endless if it can actually get there, right? But the issue is getting it there first. And a lot of it is when you talk about kind of who owns the means, right now it's the US companies they're getting the $41 billion of US aid money. And how do you get that to the local organizations to open up these channels is really kind of the big question. And how do you then sneak their voice into US law, procurement law that goes back, over 60 years, and is based on the military. And one of the ways, to do that is money in its original form, as you stated. How do you incentivize these kind of companies to give up some of their money to local organizations? And the way that you do that is actually by making them more profitable in doing so. And so we've actually found a mechanism that they actually get paid through tokens by bringing in more local companies into their ecosystem. And then they're making a profit off of that, which then drives local organizations to be able to do their work more effectively and inject more finance at the local level. And in the same time, with token, you can then sneak governance rights into that system as well, so that not only are they benefiting from the profits, but they're also getting their voice in the way that government procurement is occurring, so they can actually then have a say which then goes right back down to the low level of the effectiveness of the whole system.
And then, Jeff, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I just want to give a very different perspective on sort of collaborative capital, just grounded in our work in communities. So one of my main jobs is to get the capital stack right, and the other main job is to get the sequencing right. We're working in a community where they don't have the wealth to make the investments, and the last thing we want to do is ask a community member to put money into something they won't see return for 7 years. So the local ownership transition kicks off 5 years after the project has been built. And we use this time frame. Basically, it's a collaboration of capital for a social purpose, social and environmental purpose. So our job in getting the capital stack right, it involves half the stack right now is public funding. There's some institutional debt. There's some mission-driven equity investors, and there's some philanthropy. And all of these sources come together to fund the construction closing. Then the community members it's all open books. They're going to see exactly what money comes in, how it goes out. They get presented with the opportunity to understand that as they build value in this project, because it's in their neighborhoods, it's run by their neighbor, they're de-risking their own future investment, because after 5 years, they'll be able to buy in when the initial money comes out. They're also de-risking it for the initial investors. So the sequencing on that is critical, and the blended capital stack is critical. And our job is to say to the general community is like, look, this is a hard problem to solve. No one source of capital is going to solve it on its own. The way we use philanthropy is incredibly catalytic. So you philanthropists, you have a chance to actually go upstream. And we need to be able to help the greater community understand that this is the most efficient way to use capital to solve this issue. And then with the locals, we give them an opportunity to build their governance, build their agency, and ultimately own the project. So there's a lot of sequencing and a lot of coordination of capital.
I think that's a really great point too, because the sequencing and coordination, I mean, Ethan, when you look at something like collaborative finance, we've always talked about, this sort of like localist cosmopolitanism, like networks of networks, right, in Cosmos. But how do you kind of get that governance right, where maybe you're talking about, some SaaS company that has invoices out to another one, and they're all maybe local Toronto companies. And then like, how does governance in that network work? Is there governance? Are they just finance customers of Ko-Fi? Like, what's your perspective on kind of what Jeff's talking about?
Jeff's talking about a problem I don't know how to think about yet, which is the capital financing problem. I just get stuck. And so, so I'm starting from working capital, which I think is a easier problem, frankly, less impactful to start with, but also relevant, especially to small businesses, right? And there is a governance problem there, which is that when you look at the graph and you run graph algorithms to find all these closed loops, the solutions are not unique, right? So there's multiple possible solutions, and the way to think about this is, well, you could have intersecting loops, and you can only clear one or the other, right? And so who's going to get the benefit, right? And so there's a distribution problem, right? And really, one of the core issues with money is this distribution problem. Like, who does the money get distributed to, right? And when you have a central banking model, well, it gets distributed to large financial institutions and to big enterprises, and that's who gets bailed out. That's who the new money goes to. And so the question is, well, can we build a more bottom-up system that can take a different approach to this distribution problem, starting with not even having to issue money, but just clear debt, and to prioritize clearing debt for maybe the most vulnerable, or for the nonprofits, or for those who are more participatory or local, or whatever the case may be. But then there also you can start to do issuance, which is involves another set of governance complexities when you introduce things like mutual credit, right? Which is where communities can kind of get together and allow themselves to introduce their own currencies that they're willing to accept, because they know others in the community will accept it, right? And that has its own governance challenges to make sure, that you don't issue too much, and that it's correctly backed, and so on. So there's a lot of complexity here.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like at every level with the technologies you folks are developing, there's both the immediate consumers of the technology, and then there's like a meta level of the protocol governance, right? Where as you pull more people into the network, like Lindsay, for instance, you're talking about tokenization with some of the big procurement providers and getting them to be incentivized to bring local actors in. Do the local actors only ever transact through that network, through their intermediary, or do they actually at some point go, oh, wait, I'm bringing value to this larger network that USAID is bootstrapped, I should maybe have a piece of the upside. And then you get in some really hairy space around like international law and upside. So I guess where I'm trying to go with this is to say, not any of you can start, but I'm curious to know, as some of this stuff becomes more digitized, AI is already coming in the picture, Cosmos and payment graphs and payment networks and stuff has been out there for a few years, almost a decade now. What do we do as technologists and also folks with their boots on the ground? What do we do to ensure that some of the folks who are in these communities aren't ultimately left out of the protocol level governance, right? They're not just mere consumers of the tech. It solves their problem, sure, but is there a way for us to ensure that they're included at that higher level? And any of you can start.
Well, I'll go ahead, but again, I start with a practical application and then go to the tech. So in our governance scenario, the idea is for these large mixed-use projects to be owned by a broad base of community members forever. And we have a concept of multiple classes of membership. And one class of membership will emphasize governance, and that will be the class of membership that comes through the nonprofit channel. So as we get donations into the project to fund the construction closing, eventually that ownership, it's very complex, but it shows up as debt originally because it allows us to get more public subsidies from the federal government. It's a good hack of the philanthropy. We get a 30% lift on the philanthropy up front by structuring its debt. Eventually, it turns into ownership, and that will be granted to a local nonprofit, which will have long-term governance to ensure the property doesn't just get flipped and sold out of the community. So that class of shares has a strong kind of meta governance role. Then another class of shares for the general community members has an emphasis on earnings because they don't have a lot of wealth. They want to build wealth. So their class of shares will have less kind of custodial governance role, but a lot of earning potential, and they'll have some governance. There was a speaker earlier that said, in those situations, you offer a menu and they can pick from a menu. So in a way, the community members will be helping steer the programmatic use of the property and, maybe some incentives for teachers to be able to live there, that sort of thing, but they won't be on the deep level of governance of, will this property get sold? So we're trying to design the governance to match the interests. So the reciprocities amongst all the different stakeholders is matched with the governance and the return.
Sean, I want to go to you next just because you're in Singapore and you might want to go to bed soon. So just to reiterate, you've been across the African continent working in these projects, local ownership, local actors have been really near and dear to your heart for a while. How do you ensure that some of the folks you're working with aren't just consumers and generators of mere carbon credits, but maybe can point you toward the next solution their community needs?
Yeah, so I think that these finance considerations need to be nested within social systems. So community cooperatives, for instance, there's a bookstore, there's e-books, and community groups that get together and decide who should get the next allocation and so on. And I think the sort of non-digital technology example that was very profound to me, probably 15 years ago, in Bangladesh, I was invited by an minister to see the Green memory system. And groups of women get together, the loan officer comes with an empty book, a ledger, everyone pays back their loans in a community meeting, and then bids on the pile of cash that is literally sitting in front of everyone. And there's community discussion around, someone proposes these fish ponds, and governments of the community say, well, I think maybe there's a TV fish in my community already. And so, bringing the social process and social networks and governance mechanisms together with the technology is enabling. I think mechanisms like that, principles like that, can be expanded and made more efficient and possibly more trustworthy using better technology. But the social technologies are important to the financing technology.
And Lindsay.
Yeah, so we just structured so that 80% of we structured based on contracting volume. So the amount of money that actually these organizations are doing with the government provides ownership. And so the firm that's introducing the local company gets about 20%, and then the local organization gets 80%. And that goes into decision making around how the system works, so that in that way they actually get a voice based on their the amount of work they do with the government that controls a lot of the procurement rules and gives them the say in how that money is allocated.
Amazing. And Ethan, you have the last word, my friend. Then we'll go to questions.
What was the question?
Oh, really just how do we ensure that everyone isn't just that you don't become the next monopoly extractive payment network? How do we balance the consumer, being a consumer of your tech, and the governance of it long term?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I think, the answers we've heard mostly come back to local ownership and representation and, giving ownership to the people using the systems, sort of, I think, the best we know how to do at this point. I think about Ethereum a lot. Ethereum is a really interesting case for me because they have really strong values and ideals, and sometimes they backfire. And one of them, is this idea of censorship resistance, right? They want anyone to be able to use the system and no one to be excluded from the system. And that's a very amicable, aspiration. But one of the results of that, and the way the system has been designed, is that it's actually expensive to use the system. Well, if it costs too much money to use the system, that's almost a form of censorship that excludes people, who can't afford that, right? So now there's all this work in, okay, how do we move it, off chain and create other ways to scale? And so, I think we just need to be careful that, that certain design decisions that seem like, they're following the right ideals don't have these sort of, second order consequences that kind of backfire. And it seems like generally the way to do that is by embedding in, local ownership and giving people ownership, even if that might seem like it might compromise some other, kind of ideal, like, oh, the system's accessible globally, or, there can't be censorship, there's trade-offs everywhere. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. We have time for about 2 questions. If anyone out there has one, let us know and we'll run the mic to you. And David, of course. and we'll go to you next.
I'll try to actually have a question.
No.
So we are doing in Baltimore, similar what Jeff is doing in Kansas City, red line neighborhoods, investing in them, making sure that the newly improved neighborhood is owned by community. We see multiple uses for whatever we're going to call it today, blockchain, Web3, but not crypto, DeFi. What the promise in the beginning, I thought, was monetary. Bitcoin said you could rage quit a currency. If you create a working local economy by the revitalization of assets, so you've taken ground where there was no economic activity, you've invested in it, so there's actually value in the assets and performance in the assets, and you've used crypto to distribute the equity and the governance, aren't you this close to having a fungible local asset that, so the renter who's received their equity could go down to the corner store, to the grocer who's selling Cokes there, and sell use their Baltimore coin to buy a Coke? And it's like real money, because this is based on the ground, on the assets. It's like the gold standard, but not fiat. Isn't that the dream? Like you could rage quit the US dollar. You could rage quit the military petro complex. I mean, I know it's a fever dream, but isn't that the dream?
What's the Coke priced in? What's the Coke priced in?
What is the Coke priced in?
What's the price of the Coke? And what currency is the shop owner pricing it in?
Okay, so this is like grassroots economics, right? Where they just handed out currency and then figured that out, right? Except in the case of this currency, it's actually asset-based. It's actually worth something, right? So I don't know, what's the Coke worth in grassroots economics communities?
So they priced it in eggs, but the eggs have a value in the local currency.
Okay, so it's worth 1/100% of your rent.
Did you want to say something?
The level of equity ownership by the employees of your site or your expected site? And in the next 10 years, how many employees do you think you will grow to? And how do they get that equity ownership? Thank you.
I think that's for you. I don't have a site.
We could go through all of them, but I think
Sure.
yours is easy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not going to answer for you. Go ahead, Ethan. And then we can just go around and you can answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I run a cooperative, so it's every employee after 9 months gets one voting share. The economic rights are non-uniformly distributed, and they're based on seniority and when you joined. But it is more uniform than typical startup. But the voting rights are one person, one vote.
Yeah, and our structure, we're built a platform, so there's a national nonprofit that supports local for-profits that are run by the community leaders who are taking on these large real estate projects. And it's basically a developer entity, which actually has very few employees, and the local leadership own 80% of the company, and they are basically employee owners. And then as a development project, frankly, most of the jobs will be contracted. Sort of building management services, and then there's companies that are being brought in. And one of the secret sauces of real estate is, especially in a community like this where it's been so disadvantaged for so long, is we have a big role in helping, well, the local community has a big role in helping define what companies come in. And then we have a big role in helping support them and can help influence their ownership structures. So it's an unfolding in the case of real estate. It's not something I can prescribe as the outside nonprofit entity that's helping, but it's something I can encourage and structure up front in the developer itself.
And Lindsay and Sean, you can also pass. It's up to you if you'd like to answer the question.
Ours is what I mentioned before. So it's based on the contracting volume with which you work with the government. And it's split 80-20 between the local organizations getting 80% and the introduction organization that does kind of all the auditing and the compliance of the 20%.
And Sean, did you hear the question? Oh, I think we can't hear Sean. Oh, there you go. Nice. And we have one more question right there with Rodney, I believe. Yep.
Are in terms of ensuring that the holders of, let's say, the tokens or these ownership, we have to know their identity, their location, and things like that. So isn't a necessary precondition to all this something like decentralized identity?
Generally speaking, yes.
For us, a huge component of using taxpayer money, which is what this aid is about, is that there has to be a huge amount of audit, clearance, regulations, and so it's very hard to work with local organizations to get that information to comply with U.S. government. Is really difficult, which is why we have to work through these through these normal Beltway bandits, these normal partners, to actually incentivize them to do that auditing themselves and take on that burden of vetting the local organization. But then we've created a system where others can buy access to that kind of vetting, and that has become a profit stream for these institutional partners. And so we pass that cost. We've created that burden into an incentive that's an extra revenue stream for them.
I mean, quickly, KYC is a core function we're looking for in our technology partner. And, I'm not determining how the local community is going to incentivize different community members and how they're going to allocate the opportunity. The community will do that. And We anticipate some incentives to residents, some to businesses that form in the real estate developments, and then there'll be obviously equity available to a broader cross section of the community. But the KYC function has to be extremely efficient, and there's already some decent solutions out there, but we're going to wait until we have to make a choice because we think they're going to keep getting better.
We have decentralized identity both in portfolio, as to real estate KYC, so the distributor of license, for instance, onboards the customers and has a database with the names and addresses of the customers, but the payment system, once someone has a decentralized identifier, credential associated with that, doesn't need to know the personal information of the user. And so we have this decentralized way of separating out the service systems.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the first question for a second. I didn't mean to leave you on such an unsatisfying note. Yeah, I was going to say, I could talk for hours about that question. I mean, that is the holy grail. And the question is, how do we get there? And I have no idea. And I think it'll take 50 years. And so I'm trying to map out a research program is the best I can say. But Will might know better. So, yeah, grassroots economics. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. We have a 40-minute break to the closing plenary, so enjoy yourselves, grab a drink.
Thanks, everyone.